Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar on double counts. Before we start, a few words about AgroSolutions and who we are. AgroSolutions is a consulting company specialized in agronomy and the environment. We belong to the In Vivo Agricultural Cooperative, which is the first European agricultural cooperative union. And we work for all the players of the agricultural value chain, large industrial groups, but also banks and investment funds on the subject of the environmental transition of agriculture. In France, we work with the French government in the creation and the development of a national carbon farming scheme, the label Bas Carbone. We also create and develop digital tools for carbon farming MRV and Scope 3 reporting for agro-food companies and agricultural cooperatives. And at the European level, we're working for the European Commission on carbon farming as part of the MARVIC project. The MARVIC project is funded by the European Union. It aims to propose rules, methods, and digital tools for the calculation of the climate benefits of carbon farming within the framework of the CRCF. So here, we will share with you some of the work on the issues of double counting and the recommendation we draw from this work. In order to concretely illustrate the issues around the double counting of climate benefits in agriculture, we will start with a concrete example, that of a crop production farm in crop rotation, vertically integrated into an agro-industrial value chain committed to climate reporting of its Scope 3. From this example, we will see what are the theoretical elements that frame the subject of double counting. We will not have time to go into details about the theory of the different texts, standards, and laws, but we will point out the essential elements to remember. And the complete analysis will be shared in a written report in the form of a scoping paper by the end of the year. After analyzing what the different texts, standards, and theoretical elements propose, we will return to our field example to see concretely the claims that are possible, those that are not possible, and those for which the non-alignment of the standards means that it is not yet possible to clearly take position. We will point out the persisting limit on the subject of double counting, and that contributes to undermine the funding of the transition. To finally share a reflection on how a public certification framework such as the CRCF could help to solve these issues. As we are limited by time, we are not planning a Q&A session during this webinar, but please feel free to send us your questions at the address below. We will answer you privately, and we will make a public summary of all the questions received anonymously and the answers provided. And this support, enriched with the synthesis of questions and answers, will then be publicly shared. It will be available on the MARVIC project website, as well as a replay of this webinar. So, to start, as stated in the introduction, in order to concretely illustrate the issue of double counting in agriculture, we will take the example of a farm producing cereal in crop rotation, vertically integrated into an agro-industrial processing value chain. In our example, the farm produces grain that is sold to an agricultural cooperative, stored in silos, which sell to a mill, which then distributes its flour to a factory. The chain represented here is that of the upstream Scope 3 of the agro-industry. And we will focus more particularly on analyzing what is happening on an agricultural plot of a farm. The plot is cultivated in crop rotation, which is a succession of crops year after year on the same plot. For example, here, on a simple case, rapeseed, wheat, and barley. Very general common case in France. In theory, all the plot of a farm can be cultivated with the same crop rotation, so that each year the farm supplies the agribusiness with, in our example, wheat, which can be produced by different set of plots under the same crop rotation each year. If we focus on the technical options for the low carbon transition of this wet production, in theory, there are two main possible approaches. Here, we represent the first option, and the simplest, which is a modification of a technical itinerary of wet cultivation. The changes only apply to the wet culture, to wet farming practices, but not to the rest of the crop rotation. For example, we have listed some low carbon transition levers and the carbon pools on which they can act. Reduce fertilizer quantity through better management, through the increase of organic amendments, and, for example, reduce fertilizer impact per quantity through change of fertilizer type. Those kind of practice change at the crop level are effective to reduce greenhouse gases emission, but they're not the most effective for everything related to carbon removals, be they below ground or above ground carbon removals. So the other major type of approach that can be carried out is a systemic transition at the scale of a farm cropping system, through which a wider range of agronomic levers can be adopted to lever on carbon removals. For example, extending the crop rotation to introduce a crop with a low input level demand and a high carbon storage potential. Here, in our example, hemp, this will reduce the average emissions of the entire rotation and store carbon in the soil. We can also add cover crops, here in our example, upstream of the spring crops, which will increase the carbon storage in the soil during the crop rotation. One possibility is that these cover crops incorporate a mix of legume crops, which will reduce the dose of mineral fertilization and therefore reduce the average emissions of the crop rotation. Finally, to move even further, we can add trees in agroforestry or hedges. This will contribute to store carbon in the above ground carbon pools. The systematic approach is much more effective to significantly improving the carbon footprint of agriculture. It is this kind of approach that is sometimes characterized as regenerative agriculture and which allows, in addition to the benefits on the climate, to generate significant environmental benefits related to the strengthening of the ecosystem functions of soil, of biodiversity, water, soil, whatsoever. But the difficulty is that this approach is more complex for farmers to be carried out. It presents more agronomic and economic risks and is more expensive overall. So this is, above all, the economic model of this type of transition that must be de-risked and for which the issues of double counting are currently blocking. Why? Because there are two main types of fundings to finance the agricultural transition: inside and outside value chain fundings. And the difficulty is that the willingness to pay of each of the actors, within and outside value chain based actors, is based on the need not to double count the climate benefits. And how to guarantee that, for the moment, unfortunately, is not very clear. I mean, it could be clear in this simple situation, but how about that one? When new crops are added and levels that do not clearly pertain to any vertically integrated crop. So the first question that we must answer when we want to deal with these sources of financing is to separate among the overall climate benefit of a farm what is included within a value chain versus what is not included in the value chain. And to what we can see on the field, there are three main types of approaches. The first one, and the strictest, is the one in which the agri-food company or any company buying farm crops and reporting on its scope 3 will report on its scope 3 the climate benefits strictly limited to the practice change directly linked to the crop it buys, in this case, wet. The second type of approach is an allocation approach. The industrial player who buys the wet will report all the climate benefits strictly linked to the wet to its scope 3, plus allocate all or part of the climate benefits, in particular carbon removals, linked to the other elements of the crop rotation. Finally, the last type of approach observed is what we can call first come, first served. The wet customer allocates to himself all the climate benefits linked to changes in the crop rotation. This approach is most often practiced when all practice changes are financed by the actor in question. Still, it does not prevent against double counts. Unfortunately, there is no rule, neither clear nor official, on the perimeter of farms to be assigned to value chains approaches. This lack of clear rules means that everyone can interpret reality to their advantages and creates a risk of double counting. This reality is the first obstacle to the financing of systemic transition on farms. Agro-industries are reluctant to finance practice changes that they're not sure that they can claim, or that could be claimed by other agro-industries, buyer of the other crops in the rotation, and who are sometimes their competitors. There is also a challenge in being able to finance what lies beyond the value chains. In France, for example, it is estimated that only 15% of crops are integrated into value chains under contract and committed to Scope 3 reporting. So in order to finance systemic transition, it is essential to create financing mechanisms that can go beyond the culture embedded in value chains, and to ensure the coexistence of sources of financing within and outside value chains. So now let's dive into more details on what theories say on double counts, and I will leave the floor to my colleague, Roman.
Yes, thank you. So first, let's define what we mean by double counting risks. So this refers to any situation where a climate benefit is counted and claimed more than once. Such risks undermine our ability to accurately assess global progress towards climate neutrality. Double counting can manifest in three main forms. So double use occurs where multiple parties use a single GHG emission reduction or removal unit. Double issuance occurs where multiple GHG emission reductions or removal units are issued for the same GHG emission reductions or removal. And double claiming occurs where multiple parties claim the right to a single emission reduction, removal, or mitigation outcome. With the extension of decarbonization strategies under different frameworks and at different levels by both states and private actors, the risk of double counting climate benefits from carbon farming interventions on farm is increasing. And next slide. At business level, companies are more and more engaging in science-based targets, defining near-term and long-term internal decarbonization targets on their whole value chain. To do so, they must follow the mitigation hierarchy. So first is abatement of value chain emissions. Then once companies have drastically reduced their emission, they can counterbalance or neutralize residual emissions through permanent storage. And step 3 is contribution to global neutrality, that is optional. The SBTi directives first create a clear distinction between two main markets for climate mitigation claims within value chains and outside or beyond value chains. Reduction or abatement of value chain emissions is done through direct inventory reporting and or insetting program within value chains, while counterbalancing of residual emission neutralization or contribution to global neutrality is mainly done beyond or outside value chain through compensation or contribution carbon credits. Next slide. At the same time, on the state level, the Paris Agreement adopted in 2015 introduced two significant changes compared to the Kyoto Protocol. All countries, regardless of their development status, are required to submit their own nationally determined contributions, also called NDCs, which are their national mitigation targets. Under the Kyoto Protocol, only industrialized countries were subject to mitigation targets. Point 2 is also that there is a growing ambition towards global neutrality, accounting for both emissions and removals. These changes increase the risk of double counting climate benefits from carbon farming interventions, both by host countries and buyers, such as companies seeking voluntary compensation. Currently, some mechanisms exist to prevent the double counting of mitigation outcomes between countries cooperating under the Paris Agreement, and also with other international purposes, such as the International Aviation Offsetting Scheme, CORSIA. Next slide. In this context, we identified 5 types of double counts. Case 1 is between the Scope 3 inventories of 2 distinct companies at the same level in the value chain. For example, 2 companies processing products from the same farm and claiming climate benefits from the same low carbon levels. Case 2 is between the Scope 3 inventories of 2 distinct companies at different levels in the value chain, reporting reduced Scope 3 emissions for carbon farming activities. Case 3 is between a company's Scope 3 inventory and a state inventory, where the climate benefits is counted both as Scope 3 reduction for the company and as progress toward the state's NDC under the Paris Agreement. Case 4 is between a company's Scope 3 inventory reduction and carbon credits used for compensation claims by another entity. And case 5 is between states' progress towards their mitigation targets, so their NDCs, and a carbon credits used for other purposes, such as voluntary compensation. In Project MARVIC, next slide, we analyzed the main voluntary standards and regulations framing the double counting of climate benefits in agricultural supply chain in Europe, such as the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, the Green Claim Directive, SBTi directives, the GHG Protocol Standard, and specifically the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance, and several voluntary carbon markets initiatives and crediting standards. So as explained by my colleague Edouard in this presentation, we'll focus on the key insights from these frameworks, while a more comprehensive analysis will be provided in our upcoming scoping paper on double counting. So let's begin our case studies of double counting situation with the double counting of climate benefits from value chain interventions. The first case involves 2 companies purchasing products from the same farm. Given the complexity of agri-food value chain, where multiple crops are often produced on farms with various buyers, the benefits from a carbon intervention must be allocated among the crops to avoid overestimating the total GHG emission mitigation achieved. This can be particularly challenging, especially when considering carbon removal increases due to practices like cover cropping or organic amendments that benefit an entire cropping system or rotation. And as explained by Edouard, there is no official rule to properly allocate climate benefits between crops and co-products. This situation may deter investments at the farm level from agribusiness, as there is often a significant gap between the GHG mitigation outcome generated by an intervention and the amount that can be claimed for a specific crop. Next slide. The second and third cases address double counting situation inherent to inventory accounting methods. Double counting of GHG emissions between 2 or more companies' Scope 3 emissions or between a company operating in a country and the national inventory sharing the same sources of emission and carbon removal sink is common practice. Thus, the climate benefits calculated at one stage of the value chain is often reported in upstream and downstream stages. For instance, the use of low-carbon fertilizers by a farmer generates a lower emission factor for the wheat produce, which in turn leads to a lower emission factor for the flour made from that wheat. Next slide. Double counting between a company's inventory and a state inventory is also acceptable, as a given source of emission or sink of removal will appear in both inventories in the company if the company operates in that country. So this guidance are issued mainly from the Greenhouse Gases Protocol. Next slide. However, double counting situations involving carbon credits are more contentious, as carbon credits must convey a unique claim to climate benefits. Here we have 2 distinct scenarios. The first scenario occurs when a climate benefit generated by a farm is reported by a company's inventory as a Scope 3 reduction and sold as a carbon credit to another company. This practice is explicitly prohibited by the GHG Protocol Land Sector and Removal Guidance. The GHG protocol has developed a whole method to adjust a company's inventory for sold carbon credits in their value chain. Therefore, if carbon credits are generated from an intervention on a farm, within their value chain, companies must not account that climate benefits as progress toward their mitigation targets. This solution can be challenging to implement as companies often have limited traceability over their suppliers and thus limited knowledge of ongoing carbon credit programs on farms. The final case, next slide. The final case involves a carbon credit generated by a carbon farming project within a national territory and being counted and claimed by both the state towards its nationally determined contributions, so its mitigation targets under the Paris Agreement, and by a company for voluntary compensation. The prohibition of double counting between a state and a company remains an open question, as there is currently no global centralized organization to solve this issue. Various opinions and proposals are emerging, but there is currently no clear alignment between standards on this matter. Avoided double counting in carbon markets may lead to increased complexity in monitoring and verification, with higher costs for tracking and verifying unique emission reductions on farms. Next slide. So to conclude, we have seen different situations where there is a risk of double counting of emission reduction or carbon dioxide removals from carbon farming activities. Some are okay and others are not, according to the standard and regulations we have analyzed. And what is to keep is that there is a caution that is necessary in these situations. Let's see more in the next part how to cope with this risk.
Thank you, Roman. So I will take the floor again. So after those theoretical reflections, back to our field example, what can be reported, claimed, and on which perimeter? Well, the good news is that everything that is strictly located within the value chain of an industrial player committed to Scope 3 reporting can be reported and claimed within this scope. The difficulty, however, is how to define what is within this perimeter. Well, for everything related to greenhouse gases emissions, the rules are clear. It's for removal that it's a bit more tricky. The removals for which the Scope 3 allocation is not clear, those for which there is no official rule that is agreed upon within the standards, are removals linked to levels that are transversals to all the crops in the crop rotation. For example, cover crops, agroforestry trees in parcel under crop rotation, and hedges. To value them in the value chain, an allocation key can be used, but as there is no official rule, the best way to limit the risk of double counting is to be transparent about the allocation key that is used. And in the event that several clients of a farm are reporting on their Scope 3, to use the same rules and the same key for allocating carbon removals. Well, for those interested, we at AgroSolutions are working on such an allocation key within the scientific committee of the French label Bas Carbone. It's not European works, but it's a first step to move forward on this issue. So once as Roman explained previously, once the climate benefit has been calculated on the Scope 3, it can be reported from one level to the other all along the value chain. And this is quite clear. But then there is everything that is beyond the value chain. And anything that is not accounted for in company Scope 3 inventory can be valued and sold as carbon credit. However, those carbon credits will be with a contribution claim. They cannot be sold as compensation claim because the climate benefit they represent will also reported in the host country's NDC in the situation of Europe. And the tricky question is, what is a contribution claim? What does it worth? What is its value? And this neither is not that clear. And this is also what is undermining the takeoff of the economic model of a transition. In theory, possible uses of contribution claim would be those of companies committed to beyond value chain claims or net zero objectives. But this is theory, because in reality, the problem is that the standards are not yet aligned on the type of carbon credit requested for this type of claims. So the issue is that even if you can claim a carbon credit under a contribution claim, with no clear claim on it, it's difficult to give the necessary value to finance the transition. So how theoretically handle it for carbon project developers? First, as we mentioned, start transitioning the farm at its maximum potential. Then, maximum potential involve a systematic transition whenever it is possible. Then, calculate climate benefits, making the distinctions for all parameters and carbon pools. Then you can sell corporate Scope 3 reporting claims to companies buying the crops and reporting on climate objectives, as long as you follow Greenhouse Gases Protocol guidelines. And what is not sold under Scope 3 reporting claims can be sold under carbon credit with a contribution claim. However, in reality, complex MRV plus lack of clarity on allocation rules and claims undermines scaling up the transition economic model. Carrying out segregated carbon reporting according to the different carbon pools and the different parameters is complex and expensive. It can be done on one farm, but when you have a project involving a huge amount of farm, it's very complex and it's very costly. And as long as there is no official and shared rule for the allocation of carbon storage benefits, it is a risky exercise. Also, the exercise is all the more complex because, in reality, the plots that are on an industrial value chain today may not be tomorrow, and vice versa. So you also have to adapt your reporting year by year. And low carbon practice changes are adopted gradually over time, which adds a layer of complexity to the calculation and attribution of climate benefits to the various actors. And as I already mentioned, as long as contribution claim is not clear, there is not much value on contribution credit. Also, each type of farm in each region have its own specificities, pedoclimatic, agronomic, but also administrative and in terms of data access. And last but not least, the physical impossibility to have a full traceability for most of the agricultural goods production strengthen these difficulties. Indeed, disentangling inside versus outside value chain crops at farm level does not mean any sense when there is no traceability. Proposals are currently being considered in the revised versions of SBTi for Scope 3 for mass balance approaches, but their scope will remain limited. So how could CRCF help? How a pan-European, public-supported MRV framework applied at farm level could help solving these issues and accelerate the economic model of a transition? Well, the major limitation we face to scale up the economic model is to make coexist different payment mechanisms that all have their own MRV rules, but especially because these respectively MRV rules apply at different entry points of the value chain. For most of the carbon credit MRV methodologies, the entry point is the farm, with methods fitted with climate, regional, and administrative specificities of the farms. But for most of the Scope 3 reporting methodologies, the entry point is the agri-food company, with methods not specifically fitted to regional agricultural realities, because they apply to international companies. Each of them still have its distinct MRV rules, but they also still have their own black holes to be filled. While the objective of a CRCF is to propose a certification framework based on a farm-level approach, with MRV methods fitted to local context and farm specificities. This is already a guarantee of having a robust and transparent system for quantifying climate benefits of carbon farming, harmonized at European level and accessible to all European farmers. To move even further and to really make the link between, on the one hand, a public monitoring approach at the farm level, which is very well suited to the challenges of systemic transition on farms, and on the other hand, approaches to support the transition by Scope 3 value chain, maybe the CRCF could propose technical rules like clear and common rules to segregate what is within versus outside value chain perimeter at farm level, allocation key of climate benefits for systemic changes rules for mass balance approaches. And these rules could be, for example, discussed with standards like the SBTi in order to ensure a common consensus. And of course, in order to envisage a scalable economic model, it will be essential to harmonize all the public policies that regulate environmental claims, because they are the ones that fundamentally define their market value. This is needed to clarify what can be sold to actors within value chains and outside value chains. And finally, to make progress on the definition on a fair price for farmers for each of these claims. So these are issues on which we're working on the MARVIC project, not issues related to political choice on green claims, but issues related to technical adjustments on the methodology so that they can fit best to all use cases, the one related to farm level approaches and the ones related to Scope 3 approaches. Thank you for your attention. We reached the end of this webinar. As stated before, we will welcome all your questions, remarks through email. You can write us through email. We will answer your question both directly, and then we will summarize them to make a public report of all the questions, anonymous, obviously, and the answers provided. And the next step is that we will translate all these reflections into a scoping paper with recommendations towards the CRCF by the end of the year. So keep contact with the MARVIC project website if you want to follow up on those next steps. Thank you for your attention, and see you on the next MARVIC events. Bye-bye.